Our next speaker is Alison Webster, who is the Social Responsibility Advisor for the Church of England at Oxford. She's Deputy Director of Mission and for the Diocese of Oxford. And she writes on issues of gender, sexuality, wellbeing and identity, including a book, You Are Mine, Reflections on Who We Are. And just as one can be lonely when surrounded by people, one can feel lonely when part of a faith community or gathering. So Alison is going to speak today about that and how can we make sure that groups of which we are part are truly welcoming and inclusive. Over to you, Alison. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you to Liz, Lucy and Martin. I think what I'm going to do is probably both reinforce what you've heard so far. It's always great when you come to speak and you've no idea what anybody else is going to talk about and you immediately hear echoes of things that you were also thinking. So, but I think I also want to name some things which I think, particularly as members of faith communities, we need to take account of when looking at issues of loneliness and isolation. So I want to do three things. Firstly, to acknowledge that loneliness and isolation don't just happen. They are issues of justice and injustice. And that is important. Secondly, to speak from within one faith community, as I am, and I'll be interested to hear perspectives from others. I speak from a lifelong engagement with the Christian community. I was brought up a Methodist. I have not defected to the Church of England, but I have worked for it for over 20 years. And I also am from within the LGBT community, and I am a woman, so there are various aspects of justice and injustice which I guess I have experienced, and from the experience of which I want to speak today. And thirdly, the most important I think is, given what I've said, faith groups are not always a force for good in the context of loneliness and isolation. They can, in fact, also cause isolation. Now, I'm not saying that just so we can critique our faith communities here today, although I think it's always important when you inhabit one to be self-critical. I want to say that because of that, ironically, I think we have tools and understandings which we can offer to wider society and community about ways in which, since we're not perfect, since we do isolate and alienate, there are things we should learn from that which we can put into the pot of the wider conversations. And that's really my focus. So it is a positive focus, even though it's based on a negative, if that makes sense. So firstly, how do faith groups isolate? And again, obviously I'm talking from my own experience. There has been, and always will be, a struggle within the Christian faith community between how we make our decisions and how we form what we might call doctrine or tradition, right ways of believing, right ways of behaving. That's a political process. And within the Christian tradition, it comes in the form of conflicts really over the respective roles of scripture, tradition, and experience. So many who have experiences which they feel, or which tradition tells them are disqualified or unethical or are not acceptable, face the prospect of saying that it's my experience. And the obvious one is from the gay experience. It's who I am, it's my identity, it's my experience. Yet there are traditions which say, that's not really who you are, you're misguided, you're deluded, you don't fit. Which in obviously causes alienation and obviously sometimes a loss of faith and a feeling that you're not part of that faith tradition. But the underlying issue is, what is the place of experience? And Christian tradition, from which I speak, has struggled with that, and I think experience is now being considered much more important as what we might call a locus of revelation that informs our doctrine. So we see the process whereby doctrine is formed by a dialogue between experience and our tradition. Our tradition, as Martin has reminded us, is extremely rich and has fantastic resources within it. Also, our experiences as human beings are fantastically rich, and if they don't speak to one another, we are impoverished by what can often become an oppressive and sometimes fundamentalist form of faith. So I want to use that to ask the question of us today: what are the ideologies, the doctrines often hidden within our cultures which create isolation? Because as people of faith who experience different forms of fundamentalism, rigidity, lack of inclusion, that's in a sense what's happening in our wider society in all sorts of ways. And I want to suggest a few to you and then just go through some responses which come from our understanding of faith, which might be more widely adopted within our responses to loneliness. So, for instance, one deep underlying hidden ideology in our society, I think, is one which Martin has alluded to, which is we are consumers, we gain our identity and our worth by our economic activity. It's probably no coincidence that it's younger people and older people that experience the highest levels of loneliness. Those groupings are united in the fact that they are not yet, or they are no longer, economically active, autonomously economically active, as we are as humans when we're working and so contributing to society, in inverted commas. So, being economically productive, working, being in employment, being an autonomous person are all valued as that's our ideology as a society. So when you're not, if you're living in poverty or you can't work or you're experiencing addictions or homelessness or any of the things we heard in that amazing opening video, that makes us of less value. And if we are of less value, we are going to feel isolated and that we don't belong and we are really not part of the culture that surrounds us. Gender and sexuality I've already talked about, and in many multifaceted and ever-changing ways in which those of us from LGBTQ communities feel, even with the changes that have happened, and they're vast and amazing over the last 30 years, and I've lived through them, there are still forms of oppression which people from those communities experience and feel. Physical and mental health, another obvious one, particularly mental health because of the stigma around having mental health needs, which can make people feel that they really are not proper, productive human beings. Ability and disability, similarly. And also, interestingly, and it's interesting that Martin used the phrase boundary crossers in terms of our faiths, because I think what our wider culture has an issue with is people who have crossed boundaries. And there are good anthropological and sociological reasons for that, if you know the work of Mary Douglas. But things that are considered, people that are considered out of place are denigrated and considered to be not as human as everybody else. So obviously people who have come to this country, so immigration and attendant racism, that perception that people don't really belong here, so don't enjoy an equal level of humanity. So I'm just raising those as issues which are the hidden ideologies of our culture, which create isolation and therefore loneliness. 4 minutes, that should be fine. Because I just wanted to talk about some things that we might do, or ways of inhabiting, ways that will combat these ideologies. And again, Martin used the word subversion. I think it's about being subversive. How can we subvert these messages? Within the Diocese of Oxford, we are about to launch a chaplaincy service for LGBTQ people. Chaplaincy, to me, as a model, and it is a multi-faith model in many contexts, is about stepping aside from the ideology, the doctrine, the rigidity of any things that might say you're not a person, to saying you are a person of ultimate precious value, and we accept you as you are. Now talk to me about your experience, and let's work alongside one another to help to support you in your experience. So chaplaincy is quite a different model from other models of faith, parish-based models of faith and ministry. And I think it has a really important role to play in the context that we're talking about today. And there are chaplaincies growing in all sorts of places, but to me the most important thing about chaplaincy is that people are approached with unconditional acceptance. I think arts-based interventions, David, are similarly all accepting, because you can't pin down somebody's artistic expression, otherwise it's no longer artistic expression. And I think as the Christian faith tradition, we haven't given enough emphasis to the creativity, the fluidity, and the pure joy that can come from artistic expression, and the fact that we can tell our own individual, unique stories, and in that telling, connect with others in terms of their stories. And I would love us as faith communities to embrace the arts more. Jeanette Winterson, the writer, talks about the coin of art as being like the coin of religion, over and against the economic obsession that our society has with money. There's an example that I wanted to throw into the mix was something called Mums Who Run. Anybody familiar with Mums Who Run? I'm not a runner. I occasionally try. But I came across a magazine called Women's Running, because sometimes when I think I should be running, I go and buy the magazine to think that it will encourage me. And they have a whole feature. It's a whole movement, Facebook-based, where women who've become isolated because they've got young children, not getting out much, they just meet on Facebook with other women in similar situation and can either just chat on Facebook, but then they have meetings. It's a bit like the kind of park run movement and probably overlaps it. But just enables women to access one another with similar experiences, to empower one another to get out of the house and start running. And the thing about it is, all the stories of the women I read was, I've never been a runner, I never imagined ever doing it, but it's the best thing I've ever done. It's a bit like the baking thing. Because I meet people, I'm encouraged. If during the week I feel, oh, I really can't do this, I just message someone. So I think that there are social media driven movements which can take us into, or back to, what we're talking about as being positive, which is the face-to-face, people-to-people gathering of people, initially probably around a common challenge, but from that it expands into that much further. So I would say that Nuns Who Run, for me, is a model for Christian evangelism, because it starts from that sense of acceptance of common values and taking it where it goes, rather than thinking we are a tradition that has all the answers and we can be good for you, which I think has been our tradition. So just 2 or 3 fairly random thoughts about things we could build on as communities, unconditional acceptance of people, and how we build that into our faith communities. We have to change as faith communities if we're going to be good news in this context, I believe. Always being subversive, particularly around economic value, and setting up opportunities that people can easily access to meet other people.